Salton City has 250 miles of paved roads. It has roughly 5,000 residents. Those two facts, placed side by side, describe nearly everything you need to know about what happened here. Drive the western shore of the Salton Sea today, and you will find streets laid out in a perfect grid, named with the confidence of a developer who had no doubts. Seaview Avenue, Sea Mist Place, Lakeview Drive, Marina Boulevard. The asphalt is mostly intact. The center stripes have faded to a pale yellow, but they are still there. What is missing, on street after street, are the houses. The survey stakes from 1958 are still in the ground on many of the lots, orange-tipped and sun-bleached, marking property lines around nothing. As of the 2010 census, 81% of the surveyed lots in Salton City remained undeveloped. 38% of the habitable residences that did exist were unoccupied. The plan, drawn up in 1958, called for 25,000 residential lots and a population of 40,000 people. What was built in the 6 years of the development's active life was approximately 200 modest homes, a marina that the sea has since abandoned, and the roads. Always the roads. This is a story about a basin that fills with water when the Colorado River is left uncontrolled and empties when it is not. That cycle has been running for thousands of years at geological scale, and it has caught people by surprise every single time. The Cahuilla knew it and planned for it. The engineers in 1905 did not. The developer in 1958 did not. And the question now, as the basin empties again, is whether the bet will be made one more time. The roads are still waiting. The stakes are still in the ground. If you want to understand why anything was ever built here, you have to start with the geology. And the geology begins with the mountain. Drive south from Palm Springs on the State Route 86, and somewhere around Mecca you will see on the face of Coral Mountain to the southwest a pale horizontal stripe about 50 feet above the valley floor. It is not a geological formation in the ordinary sense. It is a waterline, the ancient shoreline of a lake so large it would have submerged everything you can see from there, and for miles in every direction. The basin beneath the Salton Sea is one of the most geologically restless places in North America. It sits directly on the San Andreas Fault System, in a trough formed where two tectonic plates are slowly pulling apart, creating a valley that is still, imperceptibly, deepening. The floor of the basin is more than 220 feet below sea level. To the south, the Gulf of California begins, and the Salton Trough is nothing less than the northernmost extension of that gulf, a young ocean rift that has not yet reached the sea. Tens of thousands of years ago, and many times since, the Colorado River, blocked by its own silt from emptying into the Gulf of California, turned north and poured into the Salton Trough instead, filling it to a depth of more than 300 feet and creating a freshwater lake that was 110 miles long, 32 miles wide, and 3 times the size of the present-day Salton Sea. Scientists call it Lake Cahuilla, after the people who lived beside it. Radiocarbon dating has established that this lake filled and dried at least 12 times in the past 2,000 years. The last time it reached its peak was around 1731. By 1774, when the Spanish explorer Juan Bautista de Anza passed through the region and recorded what he found, the basin was a dry salt flat. The Cahuilla people had spent thousands of years adapting to this cycle. When the lake filled, they fished its shores, caught waterfowl, and built villages on its banks. When it dried, they retreated to mountain canyons, where perennial water still ran, moving seasonally through the desert with a knowledge of its rhythms that no European explorer would match for a century. Their oral tradition, birdsong sung still by the Torres Martinez Desert Cahuilla today, carries the memory of both conditions, the richness of the full lake and the silence of the empty basin. The Cahuilla understood something that would take everyone else considerably longer to learn. The floor of this basin was not a foundation. It was a stage. The water would come back, or it would not. You planned accordingly. When the Spanish made their first formal contact with the Cahuilla in 1774, the basin was dry. It stayed dry for another 130 years. In 1892, a salt company set up operations on the lakebed. 12 years later, the river was coming back. George Chaffee arrived in the Imperial Valley in 1900, a Canadian engineer who had built the first hydroelectric plant in California, installed Los Angeles's first electric streetlights, and gone to Australia, where he turned a stretch of the outback into irrigated farmland at Mildura and Renmark. He was, by any measure, the most accomplished irrigation engineer in the English-speaking world. He was also a man who had been burned before, and he knew exactly how quickly the optimism of a development could curdle. What he found in the Imperial Valley was a desert of extraordinary agricultural promise, if anyone could get water to it. The valley floor lay well below the level of the Colorado, which meant that gravity, if properly managed, would carry water all the way from the river to the fields without a pump. His partners were Charles Robinson Rockwood, a Michigan-born civil engineer who had been dreaming of this project for years, and Anthony Heber, the businessman who would give his name to a nearby town. Together, they formed the California Development Company in 1896. By 1901, Chaffee had built the Imperial Canal, routing it southward through Mexican territory through an old overflow channel called the Alamo. On May 14, 1901, the first water was turned into the canal. The transformation was swift. In 1901, fewer than a handful of white settlers had made permanent homes in the valley. By 1905, the population had reached 12,000, and 67,000 acres were under irrigation. Chaffee renamed the region. It had been called the Salton Sink on maps, a name that described nothing anyone wanted to invest in. He called it Imperial Valley, and the settlers came. Chaffee sold his stake in the California Development Company in February 1902, after a dispute with Rockwood over finances. He walked away from a project that was, by any visible measure, succeeding. Rockwood stayed. The trouble was the silt. The Colorado River carries an enormous suspended load of sediment, and as the water slowed in the Imperial Canal, the silt settled out and filled the channel. By 1904, the canal was so choked that the valley was not receiving enough water to sustain its farms. Rockwood made a decision that had a certain logic to it, and which would ruin him. He ordered a temporary bypass cut through the riverbank on the Mexican side, below the original headgate, to let more water in. It was meant to be a short-term measure. The permanent headgate on the bypass, which would allow the water to be controlled, was scheduled to be installed in August 1905. The river did not wait for August. On August 9, 1905, the entire Colorado River abandoned its course to the Gulf of California. It had been working toward this all year. 5 floods roared down the lower river in the winter of 1904 to 1905, each one larger than anything Rockwood's engineers had planned for. The bypass cut, which had been designed as a narrow channel, was widened by the first flood to 30 feet, by the third to 70, by June to 150. The banks were caving. Rockwood's men could not approach the cut. On August 9th, the last natural barrier between the river and the open valley floor gave way, and the entire flow of the Colorado, 14,000 cubic feet of water per second, turned and ran downhill into the Salton Sink. Rockwood's California Development Company was on the verge of bankruptcy. The United States government refused to help on the grounds that the breach was in Mexican territory. Rockwood went to New York and persuaded E.H. Harriman of the Southern Pacific Railroad to loan funds in exchange for controlling stock. Harry Thomas Corey, a gifted engineer, was dispatched to close the breach. He ordered rock and fill from quarries across the West and put an army of workers into the field. The situation was so new, wrote the historian Margaret Romer, that engineers had nothing upon which to base their opinions. They all agreed on only one thing, that something had to be done at once. 5 attempts failed. The river tore apart each structure. A December 1906 flood destroyed a dam that had seemed, for a few days, to be holding. On the morning of February 11, 1907, after 192 consecutive hours of labor, the breach was finally sealed. The Colorado was bent back toward the Gulf of California. The Southern Pacific took over Rockwood's ruined company. Rockwood himself died in Los Angeles in 1922, largely forgotten. What was left behind in the Salton Sink was 2 years' worth of Colorado River water, a body of water roughly 15 miles wide and 35 miles long, lying more than 200 feet below sea level. No one had planned it. No canal drained it. Every drop of water that entered the basin could leave only by evaporating in the desert sun, and when it did, it left its salt behind. The clock had been running since February 1907. Scientists, engineers, and eventually a 1961 California Department of Fish and Game report would all reach the same conclusion. This lake was getting saltier every year, at a rate it could not indefinitely survive. But before the crisis came, there was the party. In 1929, 2,000 people stood on the shore of the Salton Sea and watched a boat set 5 world speed records. The physics of the place made the boats go faster than anywhere else. The Salton Sea sits more than 200 feet below sea level, where barometric pressure is higher than at the surface, improving engine performance. The water, already beginning to concentrate its salts, was denser than fresh water, giving hulls more lift. The same factors that were slowly poisoning the lake made it, for a generation, the fastest body of water on Earth. A 1951 regatta would set 21 world records in a single event. Linda Beale, who grew up on the shore in the 1950s and would later work at the Salton Sea History Museum, remembered her childhood there the way other Californians remembered Malibu. We can pack a lunch, we could fish, and then when it got too warm, Dad would say, "Okay, kids, it's getting warm. Let's jump out and we'll go water skiing." The California Department of Fish and Game stocked the lake in the early 1950s with sargo, corvina, and croaker. The fish adapted and thrived. Fishermen came from across Southern California. On the northeastern shore, the North Shore Beach and Yacht Club opened in 1959, designed by Albert Frey, the Swiss-born desert modernist who had built Palm Springs City Hall and would go on to design the Palm Springs Aerial Tramway Station. Frey gave the Yacht Club porthole windows and a corrugated upper volume that evoked a ship's hull riding above the desert floor, which was either an act of poetry or an act of irony, depending on when you were looking at it. The club opened as the largest marina in Southern California. The Salton Riviera, as the promotional literature called it, rivaled Palm Springs and attracted more tourists than Yosemite National Park. Frank Sinatra played there. Bing Crosby, the Marx Brothers, Jerry Lewis, Daisy Arnaz, and the Beach Boys all came. The glamour was real, and it was brief, and it was almost entirely disconnected from the water chemistry that was making it possible. Penn Phillips noticed. Marion Phillips, who went by Penn, was born in Parsons, Kansas in 1887 and had spent his adult life turning empty land into communities across the American West with varying degrees of success and honesty. In 1957, through his company and the Texas-based Holly Corporation, he acquired approximately 19,600 acres of raw desert on the western shore at under $2 per acre. He hired Albert Frey to lay out the master plan. Frey's design was serious: a full business district, schools, churches, an 18-hole golf course, a $500,000 luxury hotel, a marina, and a yacht club. Phillips divided the land into 25,000 residential lots, paved more than 250 miles of roads, and installed water, sewage, and electrical infrastructure throughout. He called it the Salton Riviera and marketed it to middle-class Californians as an affordable piece of the glamour that Sinatra was already enjoying. Opening day was May 17, 1958, busloads of potential buyers were trucked in from Los Angeles and the Inland Empire. The sales were explosive. By 1959, 7,000 lots had been sold at around $3,000 each. A buyer who spent $3,000 on a lot that Phillips had acquired for under $2 an acre was paying, in inflation-adjusted terms, roughly $32,000 today for a piece of desert in a development that, on opening day, had not yet built a single home. The buyers had been promised a city. By 1964, some $20 million had been spent and 15,000 lots had been sold. An association of roughly 2,200 buyers would later allege in court what the record already suggested: a canned sales pitch of misrepresentations delivered to every purchaser. In May 1960, California Deputy Real Estate Commissioner Henry Block charged Penn Phillips with fraud and suspended his real estate license, citing 18 instances of deceptive practices in a separate Hesperia project. A Superior Court judge upheld the suspension. It ran for 160 days. Phillips quietly left Salton City in 1960. The same year, his Hesperia troubles became public, offering no explanation. He was 72 years old. He would live another 19 years, dying in 1979 at 91, never having returned to the streets he had named and paved and sold. By 1966, approximately 200 modest homes had been built in Salton City. The city, designed for 40,000, had a population that could fit in a school gymnasium. And in 1961, the California Department of Fish and Game had formally predicted, in a report filed and largely ignored, that the Salton Sea would eventually die from increasing salinity by 1980 or 1990. The boats kept racing. One morning in the summer of 1996, a wildlife biologist named Ken Sturm was patrolling the shallow waters of the Salton Sea when he began to find dead pelicans. They were American white pelicans, large birds, unmistakable in the water, and at first there were just a few. Then there were dozens. By the time Sturm and his colleagues at the Salton Sea National Wildlife Refuge had identified the cause, type C avian botulism spread through the tilapia population. The scope of what was happening was already historic. Over the next 4 months, more than 15,000 birds died at the Salton Sea, including roughly 8,500 American white pelicans, an estimated 15 to 20% of the entire western population of the species. It was, confirmed by the U.S. Geological Survey, the largest documented die-off of any pelican species ever recorded. The carcasses accumulated faster than Sturm and his crew could incinerate them. The birds piled up 6 feet high on the shoreline. The incinerator ran 24 hours a day. At night, Sturm brushed the maggots from his socks, slept for a few hours, and went back out. A local newspaper began referring to the spring and summer months at the Salton Sea as the season of death. The die-off did not come without a history. It was the loudest event in a sequence that had been building for 30 years, each stage documented and ignored. The 1968 book Imperial Valley by Tracy Henderson noted that the salinity threat was constant and is growing more serious each year. No diking system was built. By the early 1980s, salinity had exceeded 40 parts per thousand, considerably greater than the Pacific Ocean. In 1985, the State Health Department declared the fish unsafe to eat and posted no fishing signs along the shore. Between December 1991 and April 1992, 150,000 eared grebes died. Another 20,000 died in 1994. Then came 1996. In 1999, 8 million tilapia died in a single day. The wave of negative publicity finally generated political pressure. Warning reports shelved since 1961 were pulled back out. The California legislature acknowledged the sea was in crisis. Restoration funds were discussed, responsibility assigned, proposals drafted. But the pelicans were gone, and the tourists who had followed the celebrities to the shore were not coming back. For those who remained, mostly low-income agricultural workers in the Imperial Valley, as well as indigenous Kamiakumeai, Quechan, and Cahuilla people whose relationship to this basin predated every development scheme, the problems would continue to compound. The resort was over. The environmental disaster was beginning. The sea itself was stocked with tens of millions of fish. Corvina could be caught in numbers that seemed inexhaustible. Water skiers launched from ramps on every beach. Campgrounds ran full from October through April. Tourism analysts estimated that the Salton Sea at its peak attracted more annual visitors than Yosemite National Park. None of this changed what was happening beneath the surface. The same agricultural runoff that kept the sea alive, the water that drained off the irrigation canals of the Imperial and Coachella valleys and flowed north and west into the basin, arrived carrying everything the farms had used: selenium, arsenic, nitrogen fertilizer, pesticide residue, salt leached from the ancient lakebed soil. With no outlet to the ocean, the sea could only concentrate what it received. Each year it was a little saltier. Each year the ecological margin got a little thinner. The California Department of Fish and Game had measured the trend in 1961 and written down what they found. They had predicted the endpoint, 1980 or 1990. The prediction was broadly right, and nobody did anything about it. In the mid-1970s, the sea delivered a preview. On September 9, 1976, Hurricane Kathleen, a Category 1 Pacific hurricane that had already destroyed more than 70% of the small desert town of Ocotillo with a 10-foot wall of water, struck the Imperial Valley. An estimated 180,000 acre-feet of water ran into the Salton Sea over the following weekend. The sea level rose. Then it kept rising. Above-average rainfall for the next 7 years, combined with increased agricultural runoff and elevated flows from Mexico, flooded the shoreline resorts one by one. The Salton City marina, already underused, was inundated by rising water. The docks sat idle at the wrong height for boats. Buildings were damaged and abandoned. By the time the sea level stabilized, the vacation infrastructure was largely gone. The tourists had already decided not to come back. By the early 1980s, the rich and the famous had relocated to other playgrounds. The salinity, the smell, hydrogen sulfide rising from the water like a low, persistent reminder. And the fish kills had ended the resort era as effectively as a demolition order. Property prices collapsed. The self-inflicted wound came in 2003, and it was not accidental. California had been drawing more Colorado River water than its legal allotment for decades, and a federal mandate required the state to come into compliance. The resulting deal, known as the Quantification Settlement Agreement, redirected 300,000 acre-feet per year of agricultural water from the Imperial Valley to urban Southern California, primarily San Diego. The water that had been growing crops would now be flushing toilets and filling swimming pools in the coast cities. Everyone who signed the QSA understood what it meant for the Salton Sea. The sea had always been sustained by that same agricultural runoff. Divert the water from the farms, and less reached the basin. The agreement required the Imperial Irrigation District to deliver mitigation water for 15 years, through 2018, buying time for a restoration plan. A plan was published by the California Resources Agency in 2007, priced at $8.9 billion. Funding was never secured. When the mitigation water stopped in January 2018, the sea began to shrink at roughly 200,000 acre-feet per year. A century of agricultural runoff had deposited its cargo in the sediment at the bottom: selenium, arsenic, heavy metals. As the sea retreated and those sediments dried, the desert winds carried them. In Imperial County, children visit emergency rooms for asthma at twice the California state average. A University of Southern California survey found roughly half of elementary school students in the region had either been diagnosed with asthma or displayed asthma-like symptoms. The same basin that once hosted speedboat championships was now sending particulate matter into the lungs of farm workers' children. The people who could leave had left. The people who stayed were the ones who could not afford to go anywhere else. Seaview Avenue runs east from State Route 86 toward the water. The pavement is intact. The center stripe is there. On either side, the empty lots stretch flat and identical to the horizon, each one staked out in 1958 by surveyors who believed they were marking the future addresses of 40,000 people. At the eastern end of the road, where the marina used to be, the dock pilings are now standing in cracked gray mud 15 feet above the waterline. The sea has been retreating for years. Where the boats once tied up, there is now a crust of salt and dried algae, and beyond it, the water, brown and flat and receding. The smell of hydrogen sulfide is strongest here in the mornings, before the wind picks up and spreads it across the valley. As of the 2020 census, Salton City had 5,155 residents. It had 978 in 2000. The growth has come not from resort seekers, but from people who have discovered that land here is cheap, and that cheap land in California is not easy to find. The houses that exist are a mix of modest permanent residences and abandoned or unfinished structures, scattered across the vast grid like pieces in a game that was never finished. The population has no memory of the boats, or the celebrities, or the opening day sales pitch. Penn Phillips died in 1979. His streets, the ones Albert Frey helped lay out on a piece of desert he acquired for under $2 an acre, are still here. What is also here, underneath everything, is something entirely new. The hot, mineral-rich brine that flows through the geothermal fields at the southern end of the Salton Sea, already producing 400 megawatts of electricity from more than 10 operating plants, has been measured by the Department of Energy and found to contain approximately 3,400 kilotons of lithium. That figure is enough to manufacture more than 375 million electric vehicle batteries, more than all the vehicles currently registered on American roads. In January 2025, a federal judge cleared the final legal obstacle for controlled thermal resources to begin construction of the first full-scale integrated geothermal and lithium extraction facility. The company expects to begin generating power by the end of 2026 and mining lithium after that. The southern San Andreas Fault, which runs directly along the eastern edge of the Salton Sea, has not experienced a major rupture since 1725. Seismologists describe that section as locked. The geothermal plants operating since 1981 have registered more than 10,000 earthquakes above magnitude 1.75 in the surrounding area between 1981 and 2012 alone. Researchers from Scripps Institution of Oceanography have found evidence in the sedimentary record that flooding events in the ancient basin were linked to major ruptures on the southern San Andreas in the past. Whether the receding Salton Sea will influence what comes next is a question the sediment is not yet ready to answer. On the face of Coral Mountain, the pale stripe of ancient shoreline is still there, 50 feet above the valley floor. The waterline of Lake Cahuilla, the last time the basin was full, which was around 1731, and which had ended completely by the time the Spanish arrived in 1774. The Cahuilla read that stripe and understood it. They understood that the water would come back, or it would not, and they organized their lives around the uncertainty. The engineers came next and tried to control the cycle, and the cycle accepted their interference for a century before reasserting itself. Seaview Avenue is still there. The center stripe is fading, but it is still there. The road goes on toward water that is no longer at the end of it, past lots that were sold 67 years ago for promises that were never kept, over a fault that has been storing its energy for 300 years. The stakes are still in the ground,